Howdy! Hello! My name is Delaney, and today I'm going to be going on a very long rant about the Mass Effect original soundtrack. Before I begin, I want to say that most of what I'm about to talk about is entirely subjective, in my opinion. All of what I'm about to talk about is also based on my own experiences that I've had, and these are the ideas that I've been left with. When it comes to musical analysis, I do happen to be a freshman in college and in my second quarter of music theory, and as such, this analysis may have some flaws and won't be entirely or extremely in depth. That being said, this soundtrack is a work of art objectively. The soundtrack of these games tells the story just as definitively as the actual game does. Out of all the games I've ever played, I think this soundtrack does a better job of telling a story than any other soundtrack. I want to start by saying the Mass Effect trilogy is my favorite game series ever. I think the story is enthralling and engaging and heartwarming and basically all of the good adjectives. The characters are relatable and easy to get attached to. The gameplay is easy to get the hang of, and of course the soundtrack does wonders. All of this is to say, if you haven't, you should most certainly play the Mass Effect trilogy. This being said, this video will contain spoilers for the Mass Effect trilogy. If you have not played these games and you do not want them to be spoiled, click away now, play the games, and then come back. The game really isn't the same if you know what happens going into it, so I strongly suggest that you not watch this video unless you've played the trilogy. To give a little background, the Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 soundtracks were composed by lead composers Jack Wall and Sam Hulick. The third game passed the torch on to Clint Mansell, Christopher Leonards, and Chris Velasco, with Hulick still working alongside them. These composers create lovely art and personally inspire me to create and pursue music. A perfect example of this would be the theme. The theme is in C major, and the first chord of this theme is the first inversion tonic chord. The song begins with synth and sci-fi-ish percussive sounds. This overlays the opening sequence of the first game. The introduction of the horns on the third of the D sharp major chord, aka the sharp 2 chord, which follows the tonic inversion, creates a majestic character that accompanies the first direct visual of the player character. This epic theme is further expanded on through the use of the root position major 5 chord, which progresses and resolves to the root C major chord, ending the first phrase in an incomplete authentic cadence. It then reverts back to the first inversion tonic chord, which progresses to the minor 6 and resolves back to the tonic, and then to the dominant. Near the end of the piece, it creates a chord progression revolving around this C major chord and its inversion, which prolongs the tonic. The tonic-dominant relationship throughout this piece brings focus to the progression and gives this majestic character much more depth. As the piece reaches its climax, it modulates to the relative minor key, which is A minor.
Well, what about Shepard? She's a spacer, lived aboard starships most of her life.
Military service runs in the family. Both her parents were in the Navy.
She proved herself during the Blitz, held off enemy forces on the ground until reinforcements arrived.
She's the only reason Elysium is still standing.
We can't question her courage.
Humanity needs a hero, and Shepard's the best we've got.
I'll make the call.
Arcturus Prime relay is in range. Initiating transmission sequence.
Commander?
We are connected. Calculating transit mass and destination. The relay is hot, acquiring approach vector. All stations secure for transit. is green. Approach run has begun. Hitting the relay in 3, 2, 1.
This track is one of my favorites, besides my obvious bias towards the horn, as it sets up the character for the series right off the bat. The theme, of course, has obvious sci-fi elements, but it goes on to set up the main conflict of the game, which all ultimately boils down to this synthetic versus organic life form conflict. Throughout the entirety of the trilogy, the soundtrack has this nice balance between synth and futuristic percussion plus classical instruments. In sequences where the player is fighting the AI robotic enemies, the Geth, the soundtrack is almost entirely synthetic instruments and percussion. In more emotional moments, the strings and piano take over, and when it comes to the winds, the French horn is all over it. Many of the tracks in the first game's OST are ambient or traveling music. But with tracks that accompany characters or cutscenes, there's an extreme amount of depth to them. This can be seen in the track Saren, named after the main antagonist of the first installment of the series. The beginning of the track is entirely synthetic, showing with flying colors Saren's traitorous allegiance. As the track progresses, more than what the average player may notice, strings and brass peek their way through. This is the music's way of showing that there's more to Saren than what meets the eye. You as the player hear this track anytime you die, plus anytime Saren happens to be in a cutscene. If you're like me, when you die, you don't sit around and listen to the track that almost mocks you as the words critical mission failure flash in red across the screen. This means that if you're like me, you also didn't stay to listen to the track in its entirety. You, if you're like me, would have also missed the classical instrumentation that come to join the synth. This foreshadowing that you get access to as early as 10 minutes into gameplay can so easily be missed that the quasi-twist of the fact that Saren is being manipulated and indoctrinated by the overarching series antagonists, the Reapers, can come as a shock. Just like how the music shows, Saren has more human in him than a generic enemy. He too is experiencing the push and pull between good and evil and synthetic and organic. His synthetic appearance doesn't run down to the bone. He has some good in him, even if the player can't see it. The first game has so many great tracks besides these two. The last noteworthy track, well, they're all noteworthy, just some more so than others, and, I only have the sheet music to so many of them, would be from The Wreckage. This track is the last cutscene in the game. After Saren is defeated by the player and the wreckage falls down upon them, the track accompanies the doubt that the protagonist may still be alive. This whole track is passing tones built upon the tonic and the dominant chord. These passing tones lead up to this epic accumulation in the track, where it goes from a very limited orchestration to full instrumentation, then into a new meter with a fun ostinato and chord progression. This track is fun and cool because not only does it have a lot of horn in it, it deviates from the classical norms by having the tonic-dominant relationship be altered with a minor 5 chord rather than the major 5. This goes on to serve the prolongation of the tonic, giving the scene an almost triumphant emotional weight. The motif from the theme I mentioned earlier is also brought back in the horns. The second game unfortunately features much less horn. This is due to the changing and shifting plotline. In the second game, a new character is introduced. Well, several characters are introduced, but this one is especially important, who has his own track. The Elusive Man is a primary antagonist in the second and third games, leading the extremist terrorist group Cerberus. From the first time you see the Elusive Man's face, you can tell there's something off about him. And with each new thing he does, it becomes even clearer that he is certainly not one of the good guys. His theme makes this evidently clear as well, with instrumentation of his theme mostly being cello, guitar, and synth, which to the inquisitive and perhaps musically inclined gamer may prove useful to uncovering his malintent before it actually rears its ugly head. Of course, the player can choose to be uncooperative with the elusive man right off the bat, but the extent of his bad character is truly exposed in the third game, where the player discovers he's fallen to disillusionment through indoctrination. Through the comic books, it can actually be seen that the elusive man has been connected to the Reapers far, far longer than the time period of the games take place, the beings being responsible for his stranger-than-average appearance. This is actually divulged to the player through the score, just like the Geth from the first game, who are also indoctrinated by the Reapers. The synth plays heavy whenever he's on screen. In fact, many of the same motifs peek through for the both of them, hinting at this fact much faster than the player actually uncovers it. Besides the elusive man, the second game is very synth heavy overall. This may be because, just like the elusive man and the Geth, Shepard is also influenced through synthetics. At the beginning of the second game, Commander Shepard actually meets their untimely demise. Personally, this scene is entirely heartbreaking and makes the character shocked. Who could have seen it coming after all? The character that players have spent tens of hours with in the first game and spend time creating once again in the second, knocks it within the first 5 minutes or so. This devastation is not long lasting though, as Shepard is brought back to life with technology through the Lazarus Project. This leaves Commander Shepard in question of their humanity. How can they be certain that they are themselves, or that they aren't just an AI made to believe that they are Commander Shepard? This is reflected through the soundtrack, as just like Shepard's innards, the music is highly synthetic. This can also be seen in Shepard's best friend / possible lover, Garrus Vakarian. He also has an accident leaving him with cybernetic implants to help him recover. This is once again reflected in his personal track as well. The most notable track from this entire game, however, is called Suicide Mission. It is the track that accompanies, well, the suicide mission. The entire game leads up to it, and the whole goal is to complete the mission, regardless of whether or not the characters come out alive. With such an ultimate and ending track, it of course had to be the most epic. With the track, it builds from the synth with an ostinato and chords in the marimba. It eventually builds with marimba joining the ostinato and chords in the strings. This once again finally builds to a climax when the horns enter with the main theme, which is passed around the brass section. To analyze this piece, there's an ostinato in the synth centering on the 5th scale degree of B major, or B flat major. The ostinato continues throughout the entire track. This track doesn't seem to have a tonic center, but rather focuses on the dominant, as the ostinato prolongs that scale degree throughout the entirety of the piece. I absolutely love this piece. It holds a lot of emotional weight to me. You know what else holds a lot of emotional weight to me? The entirety of the third game's soundtrack. This OST is full of tracks that make me cry all on their own. The first track you hear, Leaving Earth, is meant to hit you hard. The first piece in the game, composed by Mansell, this orchestration begins with solo piano and the sound of the Reapers as they decimate and destroy the planet. It's enough to bring a person to tears, especially when the strings and the brass join in at the end of the piece, whilst Commander Shepard has to flee and leave the planet to its destruction in order to ultimately save it. While the soundtrack of the third game does have a severe lack of horn, that doesn't mean it's horrible. It's fantastic, show-stopping, jaw-dropping, tear-jerking, and slaying. Another track I love is I Was Lost Without You. This piece is entirely human. It's the third game's love theme after all. It starts with a solemn solo piano, signifying the hopelessness that the characters are feeling in a situation that is so extremely against their odds. This builds into the strings joining with hope, or at least contentedness, with a cello feature. This piece is extremely organic, though there is something synth that peeks its way through. Though I can't really tell you if it signifies the synthetic threat or the synthetic piece of Shepard that they have finally come to terms with. The last piece I want to talk about is called I'm Proud of You. Besides the fact that I'm dealing with my own issues, feeling proud of myself, this piece in itself is a tearjerker. This piece has absolutely no synth whatsoever. The instrumentation is only strings and piano. It plays alongside the scene where Commander Shepard's mentor, Admiral Anderson, dies, but expresses how proud they are of the effort that Shepard made to try and save the galaxy. Both of them don't quite believe that they will be able to save it and that their efforts were in vain. Listening to this track always gets my lip quivering and my tear ducts flowing. Overall, I'm going to say one thing. I know I've already said it, but it's worth saying again. You should play these games. Even if you're not a gamer, you should play these games. There's nothing that compares, not even watching a walkthrough. The soundtrack is absolutely magnificent, and I think my attempt to show that the soundtrack tells the story is mostly a successful one. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in, and if I ever post a video again, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button and all that stuff. Thank you so much again. Have a nice day, y'all.